Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 198. Am I racist? Well, yeah, all of us are. So, obviously, if you've been keeping up with the news and the conservative media, you know that Matt Walsh came out with a docu movie. I'll call it a docu movie, where it's entitled "Am I Racist?" Now he's doing his round of interviews. I'm nobody, so I can't secure an interview with him. So I just watched his interview with Jimmy Dore. I don't have time to go out and actually watch the movie, although I'll try to. But I'll generally what I do is I wait for it to come on some streaming site and I watch it there. But since it's the hot news right now, I'm just going to talk about it, especially since it's my baby, if you will. Race studies, race theory. That's where I made my bread and butter. So anyway, as I said, I watched his interview that he did with Jimmy Dore, who I think is a great uh, personality to follow, to listen to. He has some really good insights. And they made a couple of observations. So I'll go over first some of the things that they said, and then I'll add my 2 cents, which may clear up some of the perhaps tension that, and very minor tension that came up within the interview, but also those issues which may not satisfy a lot of people who would watch and have very strong opinions about this or that. So, well, the first thing that they note that I thought was noteworthy was that it's the race hustlers who are the ones who are trying to racialize and promote racism, not the people they are constantly calling out for being racist. That is white people, right? And so white people generally are the targets of all of this racialization, race baiting, race hustlers, right? And so you're not going to talk about colored people who are racist, who hate other people because of their skin color. We're not going to talk about that. We're only going to focus on white people, which I think is really interesting. Because then the next thing that Matt Walsh shares is that, uh, one particular race hustler says that you cannot not be racist. You're always going to be some form of racist, which I actually agree with, but not in the sense that that race hustler will say. So Matt Walsh defines racism as hating others. You think that they are inferior to you. So if you don't think that other people colored who have different colors are inferior to you and you don't hate them, then you're not a racist. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But these race hustlers, they realize that if people don't care, then that's less money and power for them. And then they talk about systemic racism. And they focus on trying. So Matt Walsh himself says that he tried to find laws which target race and color, and he couldn't find any, except for affirmative action type laws where they're going to target Asians and whites in favor of blacks and browns. Okay, which I thought was interesting. The color scheme, that is, not the actual discussion. But in any case, so those were the highlights, and I'll touch on a couple of other things like the drug war, institutional racism, systemic racism in a moment. But getting now to the critique of it, um, so, first, we have to remember my definition of race, which clears up a lot of confusion, I think, in the long term. Probably initially, just accepting the definition might be the biggest challenge. But all race is a categorization, a generalization built around an adjective, a single adjective. So, black, yellow, white, right? So now you're going to generalize people, you're going to categorize people, you're going to put people who have that characteristic in that same category. But it's not just people. You can have racialize, categorize ideas, right? So hot dogs, right? Is that a white thing? Is it a black thing? Rap music. And people go crazy with this, oh, you're being racist. But yeah, I mean, if you were to say hip hop, rap music, right? Most people will will racialize that with a color. Okay. Maybe not so much now, but initially, yes, very much so. You can racialize categories, categorize ideas, political concepts, nationalities, et cetera, et cetera. I have talked about racial issues in a lot of episodes. So in episode 8, 10, 11, 12, episode 14, I talk about institutional racism. Episode 51, 71, 75, 94, 191, 126. So basically, a lot. I discuss race a lot, obviously, because I see it everywhere, but not in a negative sense. Okay. Because because when you engage in generalizing things, you lose specificity, right? So the tension that generalizations have is with being specific, right? So you create a category, but then if you only focus on the category, then you miss the details, you miss the individual members of that category or the things that you put into that category. You lose the differences between the various members of that category. In other words, specificity is lost. Or if we talk about people, individuals, individuality, individual identity, that's all lost when you just focus only on the racial category. And we do that and we don't think about anything else because we're only thinking about that one characteristic, which makes all the difference, right? If you're a fascist, it doesn't matter what color you are, it doesn't matter what charities you give to, you're a fascist, and so therefore you're evil. I don't know if you remember, is it okay to punch a Nazi? That was a question that a lot of people were tossing around just a few years ago. And the answer was, of course, yeah, you can punch a Nazi. And so all you needed to go on was, is that person a Nazi? So maybe the person is a senior citizen. Maybe that person is disabled. It doesn't matter, right? It's okay to punch that person because that person is a Nazi. All right. And so you lose the identity, you lose anything else if you focus only on that single characteristic. Now, in the podcast, I'm going to try to move quickly because there's a lot of things to talk about, but I'm only touching on these things, right? Generally, I spent 14 weeks in a semester talking about this kind of stuff in my class that I used to teach at the university. So another thing that they brought up was that racism was all hate. Well, what about love? And you might say, love? What are you talking about? Racism always is associated with negative feelings, hate. But it's a confusion of terminology, right? So if we realize that all racism is basically using that generalization based on a single adjective, right? Identifying people, in this case, situation will identifying people by their race, you treat them a certain way and you expect them to act in a certain way and to achieve a certain level of social achievement, personal success based on their race, based on their categorization, right, based on that adjective that you have assigned to them. And so that's generally what people will agree to. I've floated that definition for many years in my race class, and I hardly ever heard an objection. But then I turn around and say, well, but I do that with my children. I identify them as my kids. I treat them like my kids, and I have expectation of them because they're my kids. I call that love. Some people might call that good fathering, good parenting, right? You can also say, well, that's nepotism, that's favoritism, that's selfishness. Remember that episode of reading to your kids? Okay. That's racist. And that's how they can do that, right? Because if you literally go by the definition of racism, identify someone by a characteristic, treat them a certain way, have expectations of them, right? Well, you're being racist. But see, there are lots of behaviors which do the same thing. We can even do this with inanimate objects. If I buy a still chainsaw, I expect it to handle a certain kind of workload. I treat it in a certain way. Maybe I maintain it a little bit better, right? So we do this with everything. And it's the confusion of the terminology. It's the bias that is built into that term itself. So we generally don't use love with racism. But if we realize that all it is a generalization, identification according to a single characteristic, then you realize that people do fall in love because of a certain characteristic, right? So it's not just that people are going to be repulsed by a certain characteristic, but they will also be attracted because of a certain characteristic. But see, that's not a big deal. It happens all the time. Okay. So people want to make a big deal out of interracial relationships. No, no, no. I mean, come on. Right? People are attracted to others because of very specific characteristics. And so the question you have to ask is, okay, so which one and why, right? Why are you attracted to that particular racialization, right? The why becomes really interesting. So the fact that it happens is not a big deal. I mean, we see it everywhere now, right? It's a very common phenomenon to observe anywhere you go. So at the same time, we can say that, oh, I noticed this racialization that you have. I am repulsed. I am disgusted by you. At the same time, people will recognize a certain characteristic and they say, wow, you are incredible. Okay. And so this kind of phenomena, it works both ways, but academicians, scholars, university book writers, all those people, they will only focus on the negative, right? As if the other doesn't exist or we don't care about the positive um, representations or examples of racist behavior. I've done this before. I've talked about this before, but we discriminate, right? So we make distinction. We say you are not the same as others. We do this all the time in a positive way too. That's too expensive. That person's too rude. That person chews too loudly. That person's feet is too big. Whatever. We are going to do this all of the time, and that repulse. I'm turned off by that. I'm attracted by that, turns me on, whatever. We do this all the time. There are positive and negative examples of all of this. And so hate is not always, so building on that, hate is not always about skin color, but it is always racial. Okay, I'll say that again. Hate is not always based on skin color, but it is always racial, right? So there are people who hate others because of their skin color, but there are also those who hate other people because of their nationality, because of their religion, because of their hometown, because of the sports team that they like, where they grew up, all of this kind of stuff. It's there, right? And so hate does not just happen according to skin color. And I hope once you realize that the dynamic of hate, the dynamics of racism, is not confined to issues of color. I'm sure in one of the other episodes, if you go to a monocultural society, in Asia, right, Korea, for example, and just look at Koreans, you say, well, look, they all are the same color, so therefore you don't see racism over there. But of course you do, because they're going to use another characteristic, another generalization to divide, to differentiate, to say that you're not like me, right? Whether it's by dialect, hometown region, political affiliation, last name, whatever. There are many, many different ways to create difference and therefore have a dynamic which looks just like, if not more brutal than some of the racist things that you see here in the United States. So now let's talk about systemic racism. Okay. And so Matt Walsh, obviously being very specific in his focus, to his credit, okay, I get that. But once you realize that race can be any generalization, then basically any law which is hypocritical, which is unjust, will create the kinds of systemic racist patterns that most other people will identify and call out. So, for example, tariffs. Tariffs are discriminatory against foreign nations, foreign workers, etc. It's your foreign policy which is discriminatory. Laws that disfavor some and favor others, yeah, it's systemic racism because it's the law that does this. Okay. A lot of people don't realize this, but most laws target specific demographic groups like Social Security, welfare, right? But the rules of creating that racial category are always going to be different depending on the rule. And once you pass that rule, you create and establish hypocrisy, right? Because that kind of double standard, different standards for different people, is hypocrisy, which is always injustice. So they had a discussion about drugs, the drug war. Now, if you look, the drug enforcement DEA rules about Schedule One, Schedule Two, whatever drugs. Okay, they're there, and there's no mention of color. Right? Oh, you will only arrest black people, or you will arrest black people at 5 times the rate of white people. It's not there. Okay. However, the way that law enforcement operates, right, where they're always going to try to find the source of the drugs, the main distributor, the big cheese of the drug gang, the drug, you want the drug lord, you don't want the drug soldiers, right? That even just that alone, you're going to pick up more of the people who are part of the organization than the users. And so the more money you have, the more you will probably use certain drugs. But then it's always the people who are not able to sort of, um, you know, extricate themselves from the system as some more wealthier people, then you're going to see more of them in prison. I'll give you an example. College campuses, there is a massive amount of at least when I was in college, there was a massive amount of drug use. You name it, you can get it. But the campus police enforce drug laws differently on campus versus the way that the local police force, right, local law enforcement enforced drug laws off campus. And that dynamic alone, you are going to see a difference in who gets arrested and who is untouched. Okay. And so, yeah, so there is systemic racism, but it's not because of the policing itself, it's the law itself which creates the systemic uh, discrimination, right? And so the solution is not, oh, we should make it more balanced so more white people get arrested. No, you should abolish the drug war. And then all those people who are in prison because of nonviolent crimes, let them out. And that resolves some of the issues that they talked about in that interview, which is that nonviolent criminals are in prison and violent criminals are being released. It also relieves a lot of the pressure from law enforcement. Now, you don't have to sort of try to pump up your statistics so that the mayor can brag about how they're cracking down on this or that crime, this kind of thing. And so the manipulation of statistics also is part of that drug phenomena, that injustice or systemic racism that people perceive or don't perceive. All right. So everything beyond and built on hypocritical laws, unjust laws, systemically racist laws. Now you have secondary, tertiary kinds of phenomena in society that if you're not thinking about cause, if you're not thinking about root cause, you're always only going to focus on the symptoms of systemic racism, right? So, yeah, I believe systemic racism does exist, but it's not targeting color. It's targeting certain goods, certain products, certain countries of origin. And the way they play out in society will be the very things that people are going to talk about in the university. Because I know, because I used to talk about that stuff all the time. So people are going to, are going to go back and forth to try to create this systemic racist phenomena. But understand that no matter what they say, especially the race hustlers, whatever they say, it's not about racism. That's not the end game. The end game is for Marxism. The end game is for totalitarianism. The end game is for bigger government. So it doesn't matter whether it's climate change, drug war, poverty, it doesn't matter. They're trying to create all of these different ways for Marxism, that Marxist mentality, all the different forms of Marxism, from socialism to fascism, all of that stuff to totalitarianism, anything to move it closer to a freedom less, right? A no freedom society. There's also the like, why is it that people pursue this? Because there's a lot of money in it. Yeah, yeah, of course. But once you get a certain number of people to kind of accept it as being sort of real or possible, then you open the door for litigation, for lawsuits, right? So, oh, he fired me because he's racist, you know. And so now you have legal liability for being a racist. And so, just like car insurance, now you need to have anti racism insurance. My church, we had to purchase a plan for offending people. Right. So if I offended someone in my preaching process, then someone can sue me. And so the insurance company has to set aside money for settlement, right? And that is the added expense that is made possible because people actually believe that this stuff is real. Okay. So you can see examples of hate and violence, you know, the kind of stuff that people talk about when it comes to color, but you can see it in other situations like sports. I mentioned sports. If you're fans of the wrong team, the other team, there's violence, right? Just because you wear a different jersey. In politics, Trump derangement syndrome, hello, right? And then you have competition in business, right? Automotive, oh, Japanese cars versus domestic cars, right? And so you have people literally smashing cars with sledgehammers. They're like, oh, yeah, we're going to have a thing where you can come out and smash a car that was made in a different country. Then there's the hatred and anger against bureaucracies like the police, IRS, TSA, CIA, politicians like Pelosi or Trump, Russians, Nazis, you know, and we can go on. And none of these things have anything to do with color, you know. And so then it becomes interesting is why do people feel so strongly? And it's because of the injustice, right? It's you feel that injustice and people have a negative, very bad reaction to being subjected to injustice. There was a moral, you know, visceral, moral kind of deep, you know, sort of aversion, right? Hatred towards injustice. I mean, it's pretty much universal from what I see. And so even the biker bar, you go in, no one cares, but you start doing injustice to them, now they're going to care, right? And they're going to care in the way that they are now oppressing you. And if you see how things go, see, then they start calling you the very names that they wanted to in the very beginning. They got you so mad. They have taken away your rights. They have taken away your property. They have, you know, taken away your freedom. And so now you care and you fight back. And now they say you're a transphobe or a homophobe, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of this race baiting, race hustling thing, it is extremely subjective. It is from a specific perspective. And if you can get and convince people to see from that same perspective, there is a tremendous amount of guilt. And as long as you stay in that perspective, it is true. And so they talked about white guilt. They talk about white people who so have bought into the ideology that they call themselves a-holes. They call themselves, you know, evil, right? Because they're so ridden with guilt. It used to be that, you know, there was a time where you're not supposed to make people feel guilty, right? You can't shame people, fat shaming, slut shaming, whatever. But white shaming, hey, it's the end thing, right? So people who advertise and promote and participate in this race hustle, right? They feel empowered. And in spite of all the guilt, they're in the know, right? They know something a lot of other people don't. And so they have the feelings of being an insider. And so it's feeling superior by feeling guilty. Right. This is a very weird phenomenon that we're seeing. But hey, this is the world that we're living in now. Everything is just so nonsensical, really. And so then you're so ridden with guilt. Now you hate others. And there's the hypocrisy. And that's where you start seeing people eat their own because it's the subjectivity is just so bad that you can't avoid hypocrisy. So there's no limit to this kind of inconsistency. There really isn't. As long as you are stuck in that subjectivity, it's all going to make sense, even when it doesn't. Um, but that's how you know it's not a good subjectivity. It's not a good perspective because it's hypocritical. And you cannot have justice. You cannot solve problems with hypocrisy. That's all I wanted to say about am I a racist? Well, yeah, all of us are. We all are, but it's not really a big deal. It's only a big deal when you start oppressing others, when you legislate that subjectivity and force everyone to see things from that subjectivity. And from that perspective, subjectivity, you start taking from people unjustly. And this is where people get really upset. That's it for today. I'm going to try to make sure I do an episode tomorrow. I am actually scheduled to do another podcast with someone else, an interview. So hopefully that'll go well. But I'll still do an episode tomorrow. Talk to you again soon.